I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome back to Vampire Read-Throughs, which is like the exact opposite of reading Rainbow, reading Full Moon, reading Graveyard. Vampire Read-Throughs. Tonight we continue the story of Carmilla. Last we left off, our innocent young heroine, who is too pure and trusting and good to realize that something really strange is going on, is going on a picnic with her father, her governess, and their family friend, the General Spielsdorf, to the ruined castle of the Gothic abandoned graveyard village that happens to just be like a few miles down the road from her, which she mentioned very early in the story, and she promised she would give us more information about later. So I think we're finally getting to that. And she has recently been very ill. We know it's because she's been being preyed on upon a vampire, but she doesn't know why she's ill. And the doctor came to check her out this morning and had a very secret, quiet conversation with her father that Laura made sure we really understood that she couldn't possibly overhear. And now, based on that, her father is interested in hearing the story that General Spielsdorf is about to tell about how his own ward/niece/ might as well have been his daughter died. And it sounds like he might be insane to say such things, especially because they're blasphemous. Anyone who would say things against God and heaven can't be right. But no, Dad is interested because something he learned today from that doctor is lining up with what the general is saying. So Dad just ended the last chapter with, "Pray, let us hear the story you were so good as to promise." And now, Chapter 11, The Story. "With all my heart," said the general with an effort, and after a short pause in which to arrange his subject, he commenced one of the strangest narratives I ever heard. "My dear child was looking forward with great pleasure to the visit you had been so good as to arrange for her to your charming daughter." He made a gallant but melancholy bow. "In the meantime, we had an invitation to my old friend the Count Claresfield, whose schloss is about 6 leagues to the other side of Karnstein. It was to attend the series of fetes, which you remember were given by him in honor of his illustrious visitor, the Grand Duke Charles." "Yes, and very splendid I believe they were," said my father. "Princely, but then his hospitalities are quite regal. He has Aladdin's lamp. The night from which my sorrow dates was devoted to a magnificent masquerade. The grounds were thrown open, the trees hung with colored lamps. There was such a display of fireworks as Paris itself has never witnessed, and such music, you know, is my weakness, such ravishing music. The finest instrumental band, perhaps, in the world, and the finest singers who could be collected from all the great operas in Europe. As you wandered through these fantastically illuminated grounds, the moonlighted chateau throwing a rosy light from its long rows of windows, you would suddenly hear these ravishing voices stealing from the silence of some grove, or rising from boats upon the lake. I felt myself, as I looked and listened, carried back into the romance and poetry of my early youth." Now that's a party. This guy just got these famous opera singers and kind of stuck them all around his grounds, and it's just like you're walking by and you hear a singer here, you're walking by and you hear a singer there. Oh, is that a singer in a boat down there? Oh, great. I guess this is like the old-timey version of having an Alexa in every room. When the fireworks were ended and the ball beginning, we returned to the noble suite of rooms that were thrown open to the dancers. A masked ball, you know, is a beautiful sight, but so brilliant a spectacle of the kind I never saw before. It was a very aristocratic assembly. I was myself almost the only nobody present. My dear child was looking quite beautiful. She wore no mask. Her excitement and delight added an unspeakable charm to her features, always lovely. I remarked a young lady, dressed magnificently but wearing a mask, who appeared to me to be observing my ward with extraordinary interest. I had seen her earlier in the evening in the great hall, and again for a few minutes walking near us on the terrace under the castle windows, similarly employed. So Bertha's at this party. She's not wearing a mask. She looks super gorgeous, and yet there's this other young lady wearing a mask who's watching Bertha, kind of stalking her around the party, and her guardian notices this. A lady, also masked, richly and gravely dressed, and with a stately air like a person of rank, accompanied her as chaperone. Had the young lady not worn a mask, I could, of course, have been more certain upon the question whether she was really watching my poor darling. I am now well assured that she was. We were now in one of the salons. My poor dear child had been dancing, and was resting a little in one of the chairs near the door. I was standing near. The two ladies I have mentioned had approached, and the younger took the chair next to my ward, while her companion stood beside me, and for a little time addressed herself in a low tone to her charge. Availing herself of the privilege of her mask, she turned to me, and in a tone of an old friend, and calling me by name, opened a conversation with me, which piqued my curiosity a good deal. She referred to many scenes where she had met me, at court, and at distinguished houses. She alluded to little incidents which I had long ceased to think of, but which I found had only lain in abeyance in my memory, for they instantly started into life at her touch. I became more and more curious to ascertain who she was, every moment. She parried my attempts to discover very adroitly and pleasantly. The knowledge she showed of many passages in my life seemed to me all but unaccountable, and she appeared to take a not unnatural pleasure in foiling my curiosity, and in seeing me flounder in my eager perplexity from one conjecture to another. So this lady in a mask, this older lady who has a young lady with her, comes up to the general and starts telling him, "I've met you before. I met you in all these places. We had all these conversations. You did all these things." But he has no idea who she is. And every time he guesses who she might be based on what she said, he's wrong. And she will not tell him who she is. So, knowing what we know now, that this is Carmilla's mother, that this is the same woman who fell out of the carriage at the beginning of the story and got Carmilla to be accepted into Laura's castle, this con artist woman. How does she know these things about the general? Had she really met him before? If so, why doesn't he remember her? Can she read his mind? Did she stalk him enough to get this information? Very curious, very intriguing, but she's using all these little tidbits about him to make him trust her. In the meantime, the young lady, whom her mother called by the odd name of Mellarca, when she once or twice addressed her, had with the same ease and grace got into conversation with my ward. She introduced herself by saying that her mother was a very old acquaintance of mine. She spoke of the agreeable audacity which a mask rendered practicable. She talked like a friend. She admired her dress, and insinuated very prettily her admiration of her beauty. She amused her with laughing criticisms upon the people who crowded the ballroom, and laughed at my poor child's fun. She was very witty and lively when she pleased, and after a time they had grown very good friends, and the young stranger lowered her mask, displaying a remarkably beautiful face. I had never seen it before, neither had my dear child, but though it was new to us, the features were so engaging as well as lovely, that it was impossible not to feel the attraction powerfully. My poor girl did so. I never saw anyone more taken with another at first sight, unless, indeed, it was the stranger herself, who seemed quite to have lost her heart to her. That's not gay at all. So this young stranger, as we know, is Carmilla. And Carmilla just comes and charms the pants off Bertha. She's complimenting her, telling her how great her dress is. She's making fun of other people in the room. She's cracking jokes, and Bertha is just charmed. The only one who's not more charmed with Carmilla is Carmilla herself, who's charmed with Bertha. And they love each other. They've lost their hearts. You know, as girls do, just gals being pals in Victorian times. In the meantime, availing myself of the license of a masquerade, I put not a few questions to the elder lady. "You have puzzled me utterly," I said, laughing. "Is that not enough? Won't you now consent to stand on equal term, and do me the kindness to remove your mask?" "Can any request be more unreasonable?" she replied. "Ask a lady to yield an advantage. Beside, how do you know you should recognize me? Years make changes." "As you see," I said with a bow, and I suppose melancholy little laugh. "As philosophers tell us," she said. "And how do you know that a sight of my face would help you?" "I should take chance for that," I answered. "It is trying to make yourself out an old woman. Your figure betrays you." Years, nevertheless, have passed since I saw you, since you saw me, for that is what I am considering. Mellarca there is my daughter. I cannot then be young, even in opinion of people whom time has taught to be indulgent. I may not like to be compared with what you remember. You have no mask to remove. You can offer me nothing in exchange. My petition is to your pity to remove it, and mine to yours to let it stay where it is, she replied. So he's like, take off your mask. Let me know who you are since you know me so much. And she's like, no, I'm old and ugly since the last time you saw me. Look, I have a 19-year-old daughter. I'm a hideous crone. And he's like, no, your figure is hot. Clearly you're not that old. And she's like, but I am. I can't take off my mask. Never. You know how people get old. And he's like, yeah, I mean, look at me. I'm old. And she's like, yeah, it's true. But no, I will not take off my mask. We know the reason she doesn't want to take off her mask is because she's lying and he won't recognize her and he doesn't know her, but he's fallen for it. And all of this is completely belabored in this scene so that the reader doesn't be like, well, dude, how did you fall for it? So, now we know how he fell for it. She's very convincing. Well then, at least you will tell me whether you are French or German. You speak both languages so perfectly. I don't think I shall tell you that, General. You intend a surprise and are mediating the particular point of attack. At all events, you won't deny this, I said, that being honored by your permission to converse, I ought to know how to address you. Shall I say, Madame la Comtesse? She laughed, and she would, no doubt, have met me with another evasion if, indeed, I can treat any occurrence in an interview, every circumstance of which was prearranged, as I now believe, with the profoundest cunning, is liable to be modified by accident. So he's saying that now he realizes that this whole thing was planned, this whole thing was arranged. It wasn't just a conversation. Every answer was part of the plan. As to that, she began, but she was interrupted, almost as she opened her lips, by a gentleman dressed in black, who looked particularly elegant and distinguished, with this drawback, that his face was the most deadly pale I ever saw except in death. He was in no masquerade, in the plain evening dress of a gentleman, and he said, without a smile, but with a courtly and unusually low bow, Will Madame la Comtesse permit me to say a very few words which may interest her? The lady turned quickly to him and touched her lip in token of silence. Then she said to me, Keep my place for me, General. I shall return when I have said a few words. And with this injunction playfully given, she walked a little aside with the gentleman in black, and talked for some minutes, apparently very earnestly. Then they walked away slowly together in the crowd, and I lost them for some minutes. So this guy in black sounds just like the very sinister-looking fellows that were accompanying the carriage at the beginning. So at the beginning, we had the carriage with Carmilla, her mother, the black woman in a turban inside, and then around it you had the driver, the footman, and then 4 men on horses. And all these men had very sallow-looking faces, which is how this guy is described. Only instead of being dressed up like a servant to a coach this time, he's dressed like a gentleman in black. And as General Spielsdorf has told us, he thinks this whole encounter was prearranged, a setup, so he thinks just as he was about to get this woman's identity out of her, this guy jumps in and is like, Would Madame la Comtesse come talk with me, please? So slick. I spent the interval in cudgeling my brains for conjecture as to the identity of the lady who seemed to remember me so kindly, and I was thinking of turning about and joining in the conversation between my pretty ward and the Countess's daughter, and trying whether, by the time she returned, I might not have a surprise in store for her by having her name, title, chateau, and estates at my fingers' ends. But at this moment she returned, accompanied by the pale man in black, who said, I shall return and inform Madame la Comtesse when her carriage is at the door. He withdrew with a bow. Chapter 12. A Petition. Then we are to lose Madame la Comtesse, but I hope only for a few hours, I said, with a low bow. It may be that only, or it may be a few weeks. It was very unlucky, his speaking to me just now as he did. Do you now know me? I assured her I did not. You shall know me, she said, but not at present. We are older and better friends than, perhaps, you suspect. I cannot yet declare myself. I shall, in 3 weeks, pass your beautiful Schloss, about which I have been making inquiries. I shall then look in upon you for an hour or two and renew a friendship which I never think of without 1,000 pleasant recollections. This moment, a piece of news has reached me like a thunderbolt. I must set out now, and travel by a devious route nearly 100 miles, with all the dispatch I can possibly make. My perplexities multiply. I am only deterred by the compulsory reserve I practice as to my name from making a very singular request of you. My poor child has not quite recovered her strength. Her horse fell with her at a hunt which she had ridden out to witness. Her nerves have not yet recovered the shock, and her physician says that she must on no account exert herself for some time to come. We came here, in consequence, by very easy stages, hardly 6 leagues a day. I must now travel day and night, on a mission of life and death, a mission the critical and momentous nature of which I shall be able to explain to you when we meet, as I hope we shall in a few weeks, without the necessity of any concealment. She went on to make her petition, and it was the tone of a person from whom such a request amounted to conferring rather than seeking a favor. This was only in manner, and, as it seemed, quite unconsciously. In the terms in which it was expressed, nothing could be more depreciatory. It was simply that I would consent to take charge of her daughter during her absence. So she says, I just got news that I have to go on a journey of 100 miles of life or death, but my poor daughter is too weak and frail to go with me, so can I leave her with you? I'll be coming by your house in 3 weeks anyway, so I'll just pick her up then. Is that okay? But she's doing it with such confidence and such authority that he thinks it couldn't possibly be anything untoward. This was, all things considered, a strange, not to say an audacious request. She, in some sort, disarmed me by stating and admitting everything that could be urged against it, and throwing herself entirely upon my chivalry. So she's like, I know you couldn't possibly want to do it. It must be a terrible burden for you. Everything you could possibly not want to do, just so he would have to be like, no, it's okay, really. It's like when you apologize to someone for being late so that they're like, no, it's all right. Instead of saying, thank you for waiting for me, I am late, you say, I'm sorry for being late, so that they have to be like, it's okay. Don't manipulate your friends that way, unless you're a con artist vampire. At the same moment, by a fatality that seems to have predetermined all that happened, my poor child came to my side, and in an undertone besought me to invite her new friend Mellarca to pay us a visit. She had just been sounding her, and thought if her mamma would allow her, she would like it extremely. At another time, I should have told her to wait a little, until at least we knew who they were. But I had not a moment to think in. The 2 ladies assailed me together, and I must confess the refined and beautiful face of the young lady, about which there was something extremely engaging, as well as the elegance and fire of high birth, determined me, and, quite overpowered, I submitted, and undertook too easily the care of the young lady, whom her mother called Mellarca. The Countess beckoned to her daughter, who listened with grave attention while she told her, in general terms, how suddenly and peremptorily she had been summoned, and also of the arrangement she had made for her under my care, adding that I was one of her earliest and most valued friends. I made, of course, such speeches as the case seemed to call for, and found myself on reflection in a position which I did not half like. The gentleman in black returned, and very ceremoniously conducted the lady from the room. The demeanor of this gentleman was such as to impress me with the conviction that the Countess was a lady of very much more importance than her modest title alone might have led me to assume. Her last charge to me was that no attempt was to be made to learn more about her than I might have already guessed, until her return. Our distinguished host, whose guest she was, knew her reasons. But here, she said, neither I nor my daughter could safely remain for more than a day. I removed my mask imprudently for a moment about an hour ago, and, too late, I fancied you saw me, so I resolved to seek an opportunity of talking a little to you. Had I found that you had seen me, I should have thrown myself on your high sense of honor to keep my secret for some weeks. As it is, I am satisfied that you did not see me. But if you now suspect, or on reflection should suspect, who I am, I commit myself in like manner entirely to your honor. My daughter will observe the same secrecy, and I well know that you will, from time to time, remind her lest she should thoughtlessly disclose it. So this is the same con artist trick she used on Laura and her father. I cannot possibly tell you who I am, as a matter of life and death, and if you should find out whom I am, please don't tell anyone else. I think you do know, I really, really think you do, but please just pretend you don't. course he doesn't know. He has no idea because he's never met her before in his life. But by her acting like, oh, you do know, she's gaslighting him into thinking that. And all this is laid on so thick so that the reader does not think this General Spielsdorf guy is dumb. Like, we want to believe him so that way when it does come out that they're hunting vampires, he's that much more credible. Because vampires being a real thing, it's a hard sell in Victorian times, especially to the British. She whispered a few words to her daughter, kissed her hurriedly twice, and went away, accompanied by the pale gentleman in black, and disappeared in the crowd. "In the next room," said Mellarca, "there is a window that looks upon the hall door. I should like to see the last of Mamma, and to kiss my hand to her." We assented, of course, and accompanied her to the window. We looked out and saw a handsome, old-fashioned carriage with a troop of courtiers and footmen. We saw that the slim figure of the pale gentleman in black, as he held a thick velvet cloak and placed it about her shoulders and threw the hood over her head. She nodded to him and just touched his hand with hers. He bowed low repeatedly as the door closed and the carriage began to move. "She is gone," Mellarca said with a sigh. So, Carmilla, a.k.a. Mellarca here, Mellarca being an anagram for Carmilla, because apparently vampires can't use fake names for some reason unless they use all the same letters, says, "Oh, I just want to see my mama say goodbye and blow her a kiss. Can we go to the window and watch?" Meanwhile, Mama and her bevy of servants, these pale, skinny, wan, creepy guys, are putting on the show just to further impress to General Spielsdorf just how important this lady is, so that way he won't suspect anything untoward about her leaving her creepy vampire daughter with his daughter. I have seen headcanons go three ways about this whole setup. Either Carmilla's mom figure is in charge. She's the mastermind here. Carmilla is her pawn that she's kind of sending out into these girl houses to do vampire things. That the man in black is in charge, and that the mother is just an actor hired to do all this thing, and he's really pulling the strings. Sometimes people even think that this man in black was Carmilla's sire, but I don't like either of those headcanons. I think that the man in black is just a servant. He was just acting. He's one of the same guys from before. The mother figure is working for Carmilla. Carmilla is the mastermind behind all this. She's the one doing the setup. Whether these people are vampires as well as her or just hired goons that are working for a vampire and they just happen to be creepy looking because maybe she drinks their blood sometimes, they are all an act. They are not the masterminds. Carmilla is. That's my reading. The Carmilla web series, which we've discussed previously on this channel, uses the mother being the mastermind headcanon. And in that web series, the mother actually has a whole bunch of vampire girls that she sends out to do her bidding. And Carmilla is just one of them. But because we don't see any other vampire girls that are actually doing vampire things, actually killing people, preying on people like Carmilla does all around the village by Laura's house, like she did with Bertha, like she's doing with Laura, I really think that Carmilla is the only vampire doing vampire things, and everyone else is just working for her. And Carmilla has developed quite the setup here. She sets herself up as this innocent maiden that gets just kind of lost along the way from these very important people. It's a very shiny distraction technique to be like, oh, look how important she must be with that huge, handsome coach of hers. I'm just a nobody. You don't even have to notice me. Meanwhile, the monster is this one right here with you. It's the innocent daughter. It's not the lady with the power or the man who seems sinister. They aren't the monsters. They're just tools. The real monster was right under your nose. The innocent one. It's that much more horrifying. Makes you think, I can't suspect anyone. None of my stereotypes make sense. The vampire was our belief in stereotypes all along. That's what got me into this mess. She is gone, I repeated to myself, for the first time in the hurried moments that had elapsed since my consent, reflecting upon the folly of my act. So that's an interesting contrast. Laura's father is like, no, please, let your daughter stay with us. This is the best thing for us. Please, please, please do. Whereas General Spielsdorf really had to be talked into it. And then the second he agrees, he's already regretting it. So it's nice to see that he's not as much of a dupe as Laura's father. But being German, he's not British, so. She did not look up, said the young lady plaintively. The Countess had taken off her mask, perhaps, and did not care to show her face, I said, and she could not know that you were in the window. She sighed and looked in my face. She was so beautiful that I relented. I was sorry I had for a moment repented of my hospitality, and I determined to make amends for the unavowed churlishness of my reception. Carmilla's just so beautiful and charming that even if you start thinking like, maybe I shouldn't let the stranger into my house with my innocent daughter/niece/ward, so charming that you just forget that right away. That's one of the things that kind of bugs me about a lot of reinterpretations of Carmilla is they make her very aggressively sexy, very vampy, and that's not the lady vampire stereotype that she is at all. Carmilla is soft, withdrawn, innocent, just so pure and precious that you would never suspect her, and you really very rarely see that. She's usually some kind of femme fatale in every single Carmilla rendition that you see, with very few exceptions. The young lady, replacing her mask, joined my ward in persuading me to return to the grounds, where the concert was soon to be renewed. We did so, and walked up and down the terrace that lies under the castle windows. Mellarca became very intimate with us, and amused us with lively descriptions and stories of most of the great people whom we saw upon the terrace. I liked her more and more every minute. Her gossip, without being ill-natured, was extremely diverting to me, who had been so long out of the great world. I thought what life she would give to our sometimes lonely evenings at home. This ball was not over until the morning sun had almost reached the horizon. It pleased the Grand Duke to dance till then, so loyal people could not go away or think of bed. We had just got through a crowded salon when my ward asked me what had become of Mellarca. I thought she had been by her side, and she fancied she was by mine. The fact was we had lost her. All my efforts to find her were vain. I feared that she had mistaken, in the confusion of a momentary separation from us, other people for her new friends, and had possibly persuaded and lost them in the extensive grounds which were thrown open to us. Now, in its full force, I recognized a new folly in my having undertaken the charge of a young lady without so much as knowing her name. And lettered as I was by promises of the reasons for imposing which I knew nothing, I could not even point my inquiries by saying that the missing young lady was the daughter of the Countess who had taken her departure a few hours before. Morning broke. It was clear daylight before I gave up my search. It was not till near 2 o'clock the next day that we heard anything of my missing charge. At about that time, a servant knocked at my niece's door to say that he had been earnestly requested by a young lady, who appeared to be in great distress, to make out where she could find the General Baron Spielsdorf, and the young lady his daughter, in whose charge she had been left by her mother. There could be no doubt, notwithstanding the slight inaccuracy, that our young friend had turned up, and so she had. Would to heaven we had lost her! She told my poor child a story to account for her having failed to recover us for so long. Very late, she said, she had got to the housekeeper's bedroom in despair of finding us, and had then fallen into a deep sleep, which, long as it was, had hardly sufficed to recruit her strength after the fatigues of the ball. That day Mellarca came home with us. I was too happy, after all, to have secured so charming a companion for my dear girl. So, right around dawn, your new friend disappears, and then she's gone for most of the day and doesn't show up until very late in the afternoon. Yeah, it's not like a vampire would have to disappear at dawn or anything. And Mellarca's just like, oh, I just got lost and then fell asleep in the housekeeper's room, that's all. And General Baron Spielsdorf is like, oh, well, thank God, I just took you in from your mother and lost you, and I was so worried. But all's well now. Bertha has a new companion who's so charming. Chapter 13. The Woodman. There soon, however, appeared some drawbacks. In the first place, Mellarca complained of extreme languor, the weakness that remained after her late illness, and she never emerged from her room till the afternoon was pretty far advanced. In the next place, it was accidentally discovered, although she always locked her door on the inside and never disturbed the key from its place till she admitted the maid to assist her toilette, that she was undoubtedly sometimes absent from her room in the very early morning, and at various times later in the day, before she wished it to be understood that she was stirring. She was repeatedly seen from the windows of the schloss in the first faint grey of the morning, walking through the trees in an easterly direction, and looking like a person in a trance. This convinced me that she walked in her sleep, but this hypothesis did not solve the puzzle. How did she pass out from her room, leaving the door locked on the inside. How did she escape from the house without unbarring a door or a window? In the midst of my perplexities, an anxiety of a far more urgent kind presented itself. My dear child began to lose her looks and health, and that in a manner so mysterious and even horrible that I became thoroughly frightened. She was at first visited by appalling dreams, then, as she fancied, by a spectre, sometimes resembling Mellarca, sometimes in the shape of a beast, indistinctly seen, walking round the foot of her bed, from side to side. Lastly came sensations. Not sensations! Proper ladies aren't supposed to feel sensations. One, not unpleasant, but very peculiar, she said, resembling the flow of an icy stream against her breast. At a later time, she felt something like a pair of large needles pierce her a little below the throat with a very sharp pain. A few nights after followed a gradual and convulsive sense of strangulation. Then came unconsciousness. I could hear distinctly every word the kind old general was saying, because by this time we were driving upon the short grass that spreads on either side of the road as you approach the roofless village which had not shown smoke of a chimney for more than half a century. You may guess how strangely I felt as I heard my own symptoms so exactly described in those which had been experienced by the poor girl who, but for the catastrophe which followed, would have been at that moment a visitor at my father's chateau. You may suppose, also, how I felt as I heard him detail habits and mysterious peculiarities which were, in fact, those of our beautiful guest Carmilla. Laura is noticing some similarities, but has she figured it out yet, or is she just like, wow, how similar? She's not giving us any sense of what those similarities mean. She's just like, you may imagine how surprised I was. Yes, Laura, I too am surprised. But what does it mean? A vista opened in the forest. We were on a sudden under the chimneys and gables of the ruined village, and the towers and battlements of the dismantled castle, round which gigantic trees are grouped, overhung us from a slight eminence. In a frightened dream, I got down from the carriage, and in silence, for we had each abundant matter for thinking, we soon mounted the ascent, and were among the spacious chambers, winding stairs, and dark corridors of the castle. Okay, so she just heard this whole story that sounds so very similar to the same exact thing happening to her, and she doesn't say anything. And her dad doesn't say anything. They're just like, yes, we have much to think about. Now let's go look at this cool, creepy old castle while we think about it and not talk. And this was once the palatial residence of the Karnsteins, said the old general at length, as from a great window he looked out across the village and saw the wide, undulating expanse of the forest. It was a bad family, and here its blood-stained annals were written, he continued. It is hard that they should, after death, continue to plague the human race with their atrocious lusts. That is the chapel of the Karnsteins down there. That's a pretty heavy accusation there, General. You gonna explain that to your friends? Just gonna say those mysterious words and just leave it at that? He pointed down to the gray walls of the Gothic building, partly visible through the foliage, a little way down the steep. And I hear the axe of a woodman, he added, busy among the trees that surround it. He possibly may give us the information of which I am in search, and point out the grave of Mellarca, Countess of Karnstein. These rustics preserve the old traditions of great families, whose stories die out among the rich and titled so soon as the families themselves become extinct. That's interesting. He's like, oh, when a rich family becomes extinct, the other rich people don't remember them at all, but the rustics, the common folk, they preserve the stories of the families, I guess because their lives have so little meaning elsewise. We have a portrait at home of Mellarca, the Countess Karnstein. Should you like to see it? Asked my father. Time enough, dear friend, replied the general. I believe that I have seen the original, and one motive which has led me to you earlier than I first intended was to explore the chapel which we are now approaching. What? See the Countess Mellarca? Exclaimed my father. Why, she has been dead more than a century. Not so dead as you fancy, I am told, answered the general. I confess, General, you puzzle me utterly, replied my father, looking at him, I fancied, for a moment with a return of the suspicion I detected before, that suspicion being one of insanity. But although there was anger and dissension at times in the old general's manner, There was nothing flighty. "There remains to me," he said, as we passed under the heavy arch of the Gothic church, for its dimensions would have justified its being so styled, "but one object which can interest me during the few years that remain to me on earth, and that is to wreak upon her the vengeance which, I thank God, may still be accomplished by a mortal man." "What vengeance can you mean?" asked my father in increasing amazement. "I mean to decapitate the monster," he answered with a fierce flush and a stamp that echoed mournfully through the hollow ruin, and his clenched hand was at the same moment raised, as if he grasped the handle of an axe, while he shook it ferociously in the air. "What?" exclaimed my father, more than ever bewildered. "To strike her head off." "Cut her head off?" "Aye, with a hatchet, with a spade, or with anything can cleave through her murderous throat. You shall hear," he answered, trembling with rage. And hurrying forward, he said, "That beam will answer for a seat. Your dear child is fatigued. Let her be seated, and I will, in a few sentences, close my dreadful story." It's interesting the way this narrative is written, in that we've got the general saying these really shocking things, and the father being thoroughly shocked. Yet it's all from Laura's point of view, and we aren't getting her emotional reaction at all. As the passive narrator that she is, we don't get to see how this affects her. I have the feeling that if we did get to see how it affected her, it might spoil the surprise, and Le Fanu at this point is still hoping the reader will be surprised, because, no one had written this before. He was coming up with something original, but it does make Laura look a little bit dumb after he's told us so repeatedly how smart she is. And he's like, "Oh, Laura looks kind of ill. Maybe she should sit down." Laura's probably having, the vapors by this point. The squared block of wood, which lay on the grass-grown pavement of the chapel, formed a bench on which I was very glad to seat myself, and in the meantime the general called to the woodman, who had been removing some boughs which leaned upon the old walls, and axe in hand, the hardy old fellow stood before us. "Ooh, is this like Chekhov's axe?" He could not tell us anything of these monuments, but there was an old man, he said, a ranger of this force, at present sojourning in the house of the priest about 2 miles away, who could point out every monument of the old Karnstein family, and, for a trifle, he undertook to bring him back with him, if we would lend him one of our horses in little more than half an hour. Okay, so I guess that would have been too convenient if the very woodsman they ran into happened to be the person that could be like Deus ex exposition and just tell them everything they need to know. So he's like, "I don't know anything, but I know a guy who knows something, and he happens to be nearby, so let me go get him, bring him back." Now he's back. "Have you been long employed about this forest?" asked my father of the old man. "I have been a woodman here," he answered in his patois. Oh, should I be speaking in a patois? I don't know what a Austrian Styrian patois sounds like. "Under the forest are all my days, so is my father before me, and so on, as many generations as I can count up. I could show you the very house in the village here in which my ancestors lived." "How came the village to be deserted?" asked the general. "It was troubled by revenants, sir." Revenants are things that rise from the grave and come back from the grave. Vampires, but picture them more like what we see as zombies nowadays. Those are revenants, or it could be another word for ghosts too, just anything that's undead that's coming back from the grave. "Several were tracked to their graves, there decapitated by the usual tests, and extinguished in the usual way, by decapitation, by stick, and by burning, but not until many of the villagers were killed. But after all these procedures, according to law," he continued, "so many graves opened, and so many vampires deprived of their horrible animation, the village was not relieved. But a Moravian nobleman, who happened to be traveling this way, heard how matters were, and being skilled, as many people are in his country, in such affairs, he offered to deliver the village from its tormentor." Oh, that's convenient. Like a traveling vampire hunter came along, and a nobleman one at that, just came along and was like, "I will relieve you of this vampire." And he just, takes care of the problem. "He did so thus. There being a bright moon that night, he ascended, shortly after sunset, the tower of the chapel there, from whence he could distinctly see the churchyard beneath him. You can see it from the window. From this point he watched until he saw the vampire come out of his grave, and placed near it linen clothes in which he had been folded, and then glided away towards the village to plague its inhabitants. The stranger, having seen all this, came down from the steeple, took the linen wrappings of the vampire, and carried them up to the top of the tower, which he again mounted. When the vampire returned from his prowlings and missed his clothes, he cried furiously to the Moravian, whom he saw at the summit of the tower, and who, in reply, beckoned him to ascend and take them. Whereupon the vampire, accepting his invitation, began to climb the steeple, and so soon as he had reached the battlements, the Moravian, with a strike of his sword, clove his skull in twain, hurling him down to the churchyard, whither, descending by the winding stairs, the stranger followed and cut his head off, and next day delivered it and the body to the villagers, who duly impaled and burnt them. So that's an interesting bit of lore. This vampire rises from its grave, and it sort of just like vaporizes out of its grave, but it's in these linen grave wrappings, like mummy style, but it has to take them off. So it takes off its linen grave wrappings, puts them on the ground next to its grave, goes off, does his vampire thing, comes back, but he can't go back into his grave without his linen grave wrappings. So this guy stole them, and the vampire has to go after them, sword fight, boom, decapitated, done. You don't see that whole needing to have your grave clothes back trope done much anymore. Bring that back. I like that. Also, vampires rising from the grave without having to like dig themselves out, just kind of like poofing out of their grave. That's pretty cool too. This Moravian nobleman had authority from the then head of the family to remove the tomb of Mellarca, Countess Karnstein, which he did effectually, so that in a little while its site was quite forgotten. "Can you point to where it stood?" asked the general eagerly. The forester shook his head and smiled. "Not a soul living could tell you that now," he said. "Besides, they say her body was removed, but no one is sure of that either." Having thus spoken, as time pressed, he dropped his axe and departed, leaving us to hear the remainder of the general's strange story, which we will hear next time on Vampire Read-Throughs. We've got to hear how Mellarca and Bertha ended up with Bertha dying. Because Carmilla doing this con artist thing to get into Bertha's house make it seem like Bertha's pretty special. She's not like the village girls, the peasants that Carmilla doesn't care exists. She went through all this, something to do with Bertha, and yet Bertha ended up dying. Why? Because with Carmilla doing this with Laura, the way she talks to Laura makes it sound like she wants to make her into a vampire, but that didn't happen with Bertha. What's the difference? How did it end? We have to wonder. Until next time, I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and thank you for joining me on Vampire Read-Throughs. To be concluded. Yes, one more read-through to go, and then the story will be over. Let me know if you would like to do another one of these vampire read-throughs. I know this was a long one, so maybe something short next time, maybe something a little more obscure, something a lot of people haven't heard of, but is one of those important, essential vampire tales that everyone really should know about. I'm up for anything. Hit me with what you've got, and regular vampire reviews will be returning soon as well.